And, this goes back to Aristotle, right? Pathos, logos, and
Ethos.
ethos, right? And it's like we have personal reasons, and then there are factual reasons, and there are also societal pressures that lead us into things. We never believe, myself included, something solely on the cold, hard facts. That's not how humans operate. There are personal reasons that contribute to why we believe things. There are societal reasons alongside the facts and the data and the evidence. I find it disingenuous when people say things like, well, I'm all about the facts and you're all about that other stuff. And I'm like, no, I doubt that.
Love God, love people. It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.
Can I trust the Bible? Yes. The Bible is the most important book of the last 2 millennia. But while the Bible's influence has remained, central attitudes towards it have radically shifted.
We don't have the originals of the New Testament.
When it comes to the New Testament, we have the major problem that the message of Jesus has been changed.
All the different languages it had to go through. It was Latin and Greek and German and English. And
had thousands of years and scrolls
and kings who wanted things changed.
Yeah.
Once referred to as the good book, there is no lack of confusion, misinformation, or downright distaste regarding the Bible. Join us this November at Glad Tidings Church in Burlington, Ontario for the Can I Trust the Bible? Apologetics Canada Conference. With the help of archaeologists, thinkers, and evangelists, we'll take a closer look at the reliability, relevance, and truth claims concerning the most printed, published, translated, and circulated book in the world, the Bible.
Okay, so in our first part, we talked a lot about the importance of myth, whether the virgin birth and the resurrection really happened with respect to what Peterson was saying. I think in this second part, I think we're going to focus more on the myth of science. Especially, we're going to focus on Richard Dawkins and his place in this discussion. So let's move on to the next clip.
Jordan prioritizes myth, and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary to scientific fact, the sort of facts that tell us how old the universe is, how old the world is, the history of life, the engineering achievements of landing a spacecraft on a comet. These are the things that science can do.
What's fascinating about that is that I think Dawkins is very right and very wrong simultaneously. And he doesn't even realize it, is to pose myth and fact as opposites in the way that he does, I think is a false dichotomy. In that, yes, it's true that the facts of the reality of the situation are actually what matters. It matters that Mary was a virgin and that Jesus was conceived miraculously. And it matters that there was an actual resurrection, that Jesus physically died, he was put in a tomb, and 3 days after he walked out. But that doesn't negate the power of the narrative. They go hand in hand. And I think that's what he's completely missing, is that this is a two-handed animal. You can't really have one without the other, but they're predicated on one another very powerfully.
I totally agree with you. And ultimately, he is going, he doesn't even realize that he's being contradictory in the way that he approaches it, because he has this scientific gloss where he is really dabbling both back and forth between the fact and the myth. The problem is, though, is people tend not to be able to see it. Even people like Dawkins, for example, they tend not to even see that they're being inconsistent. And just to give you an example, in his answer, he goes back and forth between pure science and applied science. So pure science is looking at the physics, right? How old is the universe and those sorts of things? What's the universe made of? What are the parts that the universe is made of? What are the laws that those parts follow? But that is a very different thing than applied science, which he moves into with regards to engineering, that I can take those parts and I can arrange them in such a way that I can fly a rocket onto a comet. And what's fascinating there is that ultimately, as we've already talked about before with O'Connor and Dawkins, these guys are reductive physicalists. They're not just atheists, but they are atheists that hold to a very particular myth of the universe, and that is that all that exists are the physical parts that make up the universe and the laws that those parts follow, and that everything is deterministic from that point on, and that you and I are just cosmic dust adrift in the universe that are doing things but not of our own choosing, because we don't actually exist. We're just along for the ride of the universe, which is itself its own myth. And it's a very comical myth too, because ultimately it's saying that you in fact don't even exist. So in other words, it's not humans, it's not scientists that landed a rocket on a comet. The universe did it.
And notice right there too, right? There are a lot of values that are kind of smuggled in, because okay, so Dawkins is praising the fact that we can land something on a comet, which is a very difficult thing. My question is, so what? Like, why does that matter? Why does it matter that we can land something on a comet that's traveling at some ungodly speed through empty space? Right? So he's already smuggling in, well, maybe smuggle is too uncharitable word, but he is bringing in these values that he doesn't realize he's bringing in. Perhaps there are certain values attached to even the enterprise of science itself that he is affirming.
So, for example, those values are things like exploration is good, seeking the unknown is good, that you can seek into the unknown, that you can discover things are discoverable, that is valuable for scientists to do science. Like there's so many. I agree with you, Steve. There's so many values that are kind of just smuggled in there.
It's very idealistic. I like the way that you described it, Andy, when you said that it's reductionistic. It is. It's like boiling it to its least possible ends and then going with that, but failing to realize why is that exploration component even something that's worthy of looking into. I remember this was years ago, but Andy Bannister, a friend of the ministry, was giving a talk, and he mentioned that he had met with this person. I think it was at the University of Toronto. I could be mistaken about that, but a friend of his who was doing their PhD in the sciences and was studying the mating habits of frogs. And Bannister going like, why on earth would you want to study the mating habits of frogs? And her saying, well, this expands our knowledge of animal life in the Amazon rainforest. And it's like, that is inquiry, because we understand as human beings that exploration into understanding the physical world and the universe is something that's noteworthy. Where does that come from? Because why would you pour money into grants to study the mating habits of jungle frogs? Well, because we believe that there's actually some value in understanding the world around us.
Now, that's an interesting one, by the way, because I just want people to think about this, because this is one of those challenges with regards to science. It's often called the Meno paradox, put forward by Plato, and that is, how do you discover the undiscoverable? If something is not discovered, you don't know that it exists. So how do you even know to go looking for it? Science is predicated on this idea of exploring the universe, and we do so by curiosity. That person is, for whatever reason, curious about the mating habits of frogs and the Amazon. And ironically enough, most of our scientific discoveries take place not because we went looking for the answer to something we didn't even know wasn't there. They came about because we followed our curiosity to study the natural world, and lo and behold, we're studying the mating habits of frogs, and we come across a cure for cancer, or we come across something that we didn't even know was there, and then we start digging deeper and discover something about the universe.
It made her very hoppy to look into it.
You can't have a podcast without Wes giving some pun. Now, here's the irony here. Now, Dawkins challenges this idea of prioritizing myth over fact, or so he would say that Peterson is putting myth over fact, whereas he is prioritizing fact over myth. But I would argue that he is in fact not doing that at all. What he's doing is he is valuing the scientist over the science. But that is actually the myth that he and O'Connor believe, that scientists even exist. And because as we've talked about previously, they just believe, again, it's that cosmic, dust adrift in the universe. People don't actually exist. You don't actually have free will. Because again, think about that. We've talked about this with regards to O'Connor on this podcast already. He doesn't think that people have free will. Everything's deterministic. But science is predicated on the idea that people are following their curiosity, which is free will. So again, is he actually valuing fact over myth? Not a chance. He is actually putting the myth that the scientist exists and has free will and can do science over the facts.
We're going to move on to the next clip in a minute, but I can't help but thinking, when people tell me, well, I just believe X because of the facts, I almost never believe them. Because nobody believes anything just based on the facts. We all have reasons. This goes back to Aristotle, right? Pathos, logos, and ethos, right? And it's like we have personal reasons, and then there are factual reasons, and there also are societal pressures that lead us into things. We never believe, myself included, something solely on the cold, hard facts. That's not how humans operate. There are personal reasons that contribute to why we believe things. There are societal reasons alongside the facts and the data and the evidence. But I find it disingenuous when people say things like, well, I'm all about the facts and you're all about that other stuff. And I'm like, no, I doubt that.
Yeah, and to your defense, Wes here is not just psychologizing. What he is saying is this is the human condition. This is how we reason, that we're not just purely rational thinking machines. And sometimes we see this, for example, in our own line of work, because we've come across people who say something like, well, if we just give this argument, it formulated in this way, that person will come to accept Jesus. I'm like, well, that's not really how apologetics works, because that's not how we as human beings reason. And again, it's not psychologizing.
And you know what, Steve, to that note, you look at the end of Matthew's gospel, Matthew 28, Jesus is resurrected. He's appearing before a group of disciples. He's preaching to them. And it says that they saw him and they worshiped him, and some doubted. And it's like, hold on, wait a minute. Like, the resurrected Jesus, who you saw crucified, come back from the dead, is now standing before you proclaiming this reality, this triumph over sin and death, and some of them are doubting. I think it's a powerful evidence, ironically, for lack of a better word, to the fact that evidences alone aren't going to change hearts. And that even the disciples, whoever those disciples were, it doesn't tell us, it's the 11 disciples, but it implies that there are others there. When just before Jesus is going to give the Great Commission, they are encountering something that's very real, evidentially and experientially, but they're still wrestling with maybe even personal and, other doubts that are going on in their mind.
Yeah, because this is more than just a fact, even in that sense, because this is ultimately something that you are acting on. It is a truth that you're believing, internalizing, and now living according to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think this really highlights this whole conversation that we've been having, in the first part and now in the second part, where you see, like you pointed out, Andy, on the one hand, you have Richard Dawkins, who's splitting this fact value. He has this fact value dichotomy, but really he is not doing that, right? Because he is bringing in all these values hidden in the statements that he's uttering even. On the other hand, you have Jordan Peterson, who prioritizes, because when Richard Dawkins points out that, okay, you prioritize myth over facts, and Jordan Peterson is nodding, he's agreeing with this. Yes, I do that, right? But even there, he is unable to just shake off the need for this to be true in order for it to have the really kind of meaningful power that it has. Whereas the Christian worldview says, well, it's both.
In the same way that they held Peterson's feet to the fire, if you will, on this question, they do so in a similar way to Dawkins in this discussion with regards to even things like moral values, and the fact that the reality is that science is a story interladen with moral values, and that you can't really do science without a moral framework that with regards to something as simple as you should report the true facts, that is morally good. And that Dawkins, again, he's finding this, that you can't just separate fact and myth, that the story and the truth are going to be intertwined with each other.
I think in this next clip, that really kind of comes out, I think. So let's play that and we can discuss this further.
More of a Christian than you think you are. So, for example, I think that the scientific enterprise is motivated by the axiomatic presumption that truth tends towards a unity. I think that it's predicated on the notion that there is a logical order that's intrinsic to the cosmos, that fundamental order is good, that it's intelligible to human beings, and that discovering that order and aligning ourselves with it makes for life more abundant. I think that the scientific enterprise is also predicated on the idea that the truth will set you free. And I think all of those axioms are religious and derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And if you don't believe that, you have to account for why science emerged in Europe and nowhere else in the entire history of humanity, for example, and why it's under assault from like all quarters now as that underlying metaphysic disappears. Like you haven't had to be concerned with the mythological substrate in your lifetime in some sense because it was intact.
Yeah.
And so the universities could flourish and you had your freedom, remarkable freedom to pursue your scientific enterprise wherever you wanted. And people lauded you for it. Like that time is threatened, and seriously so. And I think it's partly because these metaphysical assumptions have now become questionable, and that's part of the reason that I'm attending to them. It's not because I don't admire the accuracy of quantum prediction, for example, or celebrate what Musk is doing with his capability of sending rockets to Mars. It's like more power to the technological enterprise, but you know what's happening in the universities? It's awful. And that's not a scientific problem. It's okay.
I agree about that.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess he kind of covers some of what we talked about earlier, but there's more to be said here. So go for it, guys.
I don't know about you guys, but as I was watching that last section there, man, it just gets me fired up every time I hear it. I'm like, just want to be like, yes, just like kind of pounding the table. That's right. Peterson is absolutely on point there, and it's fascinating to watch Dawkins acknowledge this, and I can't help but wonder if Dawkins realizes that he was actually part of the problem, that the new atheism and the work that they did to kind of try to undermine this fabric of the Judeo-Christian worldview that science was resting upon in his attack of that, I would argue created a vacuum in which a lot of the ideologies that have now kind of sucked into the university are at play, and he doesn't like the world that he created.
Yeah, I think it's this, once again, this frustrating dichotomy of yes and. It's no less than everything that Peterson is saying, and we wholeheartedly agree with what he's communicating there. And also, the foundation for that is the fact that in the first half of the first century, a man walked out of the tomb. So it's like these things go hand in hand. And that's where I think this love-hate relationship that I continually express with Peterson is. He says so many of the right things.
And with
right?
Dawkins.
Well, both of them. Yeah. They both say things that are very true. And that's what we need to keep in mind, is that these are people who are not, we don't need to paint them with a broad brush.
We don't need to demonize them.
Yeah, that everything that Dawkins says is going to be incorrect. Everything that Peterson says is going to be incorrect. I mean, the old adage, the broken clock gets the time right twice a day, is true. And I think that those two guys probably get it right more than twice a day, right? But it goes beyond that, because Peterson is right, and he's still completely missing the point of what that narrative means.
Well, I'd say I don't know if he's missing the point. Maybe he's just not going far enough.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's a better way of putting it. Yeah.
And Dawkins too isn't missing the point, but he as well just isn't going far enough. It's like they both kind of come up to the line. They appreciate Christianity, they appreciate what it does, the power that it has, but they cannot reconcile with the source of where that power is coming from, which I would argue that, as Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah. Historical Christianity is still the elephant in the room for both guys.
Yep.
And we could say for Alex O'Connor as well, because
Yes.
I mean I've seen him talk to Jordan Peterson because he had that interview with Jordan Peterson
Right.
one-on-one, right? And the way he was pushing Jordan Peterson, I would have thought, man, who's the Christian here? Right? I mean, not
Yeah.
that Jordan Peterson is a Christian, but man, I thought that interview, Alex O'Connor came this close, right? I almost, it made me feel like he was almost a Christian there. So all three of them, they recognize, which by the way, I think is a pretty dramatic improvement since, you know, the rise of new atheism in the early 2000s. I mean, where we are today. Back then we would have, I don't know, we might have thought this might go on forever, but that was just a blip in our, even just in our own lifetime.
You know, as we come to a close, I can't help but just ask the listeners, you know, maybe there's somebody listening to this has just never given this thought, or maybe they've been given this a lot of thought, and they've kind of come right up to the line, kind of like maybe they're on the Dawkins side of the line, maybe they're on the Peterson side of the line. And I would just really encourage you that to take that next step, and as Wes said, see what actually happens when you see these two things come together, the story and the truth of that story, and the power that actually has. I'd say the power is actually not in the story. The power is in the truth of the story. It's the two coming together in your life. That's where the power is really at.
And that's where, I mean, I know we've thrown around Lewis so many times in this conversation, but another famous line by Lewis is where he says, Christianity, if true, is of infinite importance, and if not true, is of no importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. And I can't help to wonder whether there's a moderation that's being expressed by those three individuals. I mean, I think Peterson would say it's not, because the mythos of the story is so important, but at the exact same time, if the narrative is actually pointing to a real historical physical reality, then that is the infinite importance. And so you have the Lewisian trilemma that Jesus is either he's a liar, he's Lord, or he's a lunatic. And I think Peterson wants to make him out to be a legend, which some have added, you know, that extra L into make it what the quadlemma, the Lewisian quadlemma. And I don't think Jesus, if you read what he says in the Gospels, allows you to do that. He doesn't allow you to simply make him into a legend. He says that unless you believe that he is the I am, you will die in your sins. And that has a real physical consequence. It's not a metaphorical death. It's a real death. And that means something. So I think, yeah, like you said, Andy, if the listener is listening and they're finding themselves on the O'Connor side of the conversation, or the Dawkins side of the conversation, or the Peterson side of the conversation, I'd actually encourage them, go and find out what Jesus actually says about himself. Go and read the word of Jesus in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and truly find out from the horse's mouth exactly who Jesus claims that he is and what the implications of that actually means.
You know, because by the way, we could do the same thing from a Dawkins point of view and say, okay, you hold to the myth that science is real, that scientists are real, and then that you can actually explore through your own curiosity and free will and discover truth in the world. But maybe that's because you actually do exist. Maybe that's because you actually do have free will, and free will is just not a story, but it's a truth. And that truth, when the comes out in your life, that clearly is where the power is to be found. And so, again, I hope it's clear. You can look at this from two different perspectives, whether that be from the perspective of religion, the perspective of science, and I pray that they come together in your life through the power of Christ.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this week's edition of the AC Podcast. The AC Podcast is a ministry of Apologetics Canada. Find us on all your favorite streaming platforms. We'll come back next week with more stuff to think about. Until then, you know the drill. Love God, love people. Bye for now.